Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. This episode is brought to you by Wondrium. Wondrium is a series of college-level audio and video courses and documentaries produced and distributed by The Teaching Company, my favorite company. I've been with them for a long time. As you know, I used to listen to their courses in the 90s on cassette tapes. Now they're streaming all of their courses right into your phone or your iPad or your laptop. And you can just listen to them while you're multitasking, or you can watch them if you prefer video. The visuals are all excellent. These are produced professionally in a studio, so the sound quality is great. The instructors of these courses are all professors, that award-winning professors, won teaching awards and so forth. They are some of them the top people in their field. And the one I'm going to highlight today is called The Physics of Time. Well, it's Mysteries of Modern Physics, Time. So here, there's 24 lectures. As you'll see, I am up through lecture number 14. This is the one I'm listening to now. This is Sean Carroll. He's a Caltech physicist. So this is not just science fiction. This is what we know from physics. What is time? Keeping time. Time's arrow. Time's arrow is based on the second law of thermodynamics, which is lecture 5. Reversibility of time. Could that ever happen? Time reversal in particle physics. Quantum mechanics in time. Entropy in time, the past hypothesis. Well, you'll just have to listen to that. The past has already happened. The future hasn't happened yet. Could we predict the future like we can post-dict the past? Boltzmann brains. That was a hard one, but if you listen to it, you get it. Complexity in life, and it goes on all the way down to the evolution of the universe, the Big Bang, and the multiverse. The multiverse. I love this. Anyway, each of these looks like about 30 minutes long. I listen to them at 1.2 or 1.3 speed, and you can grind through them then in about 20 minutes. So I can knock out, really, let's see, if I do a 2-hour bike ride, that's 6 lectures. So I could do this entire course in just 4 days of cycling or driving around, doing shopping at the supermarket. I've got the earbud in and I'm listening. It's a great way to use your time. And Wondrium has hundreds of these courses and hundreds of other tutorials, short form videos, documentary films, how-to lessons, travel logs, and so forth. So check it out. And if you do so through the show, you can get 2 years subscription for the price of one. Think about that. That's amazing. 2 years for the price of one. So just go there now. Go to wondrium.com/Shermer to get your 2-for-1 special. wondrium.com/Shermer, SHERMER. Wondrium.com/Shermer. 2 years for the price of one. Check it out. Thanks for listening. Here's our show. This is the magazine I always hold up, our latest issue of Skeptic. You can get this at skeptic.com. Click on the magazine. You can go to your local bookstore. Almost all bookstores in North America carry the magazine. It's usually in the science section, somewhere near Scientific American and National Geographic, although occasionally we're in the New Age section with the goofball magazines there. And in fact, my guest today is the author of our cover story here, who I will give a proper introduction of. He is Dr. Mark Skousen, my colleague at Chapman University. He's a presidential fellow and the Doty Spogli Endowed Chair of Free Enterprise. He has a BA, MA, and PhD in economics from George Washington University. And in 2018, Steve Forbes awarded him the Triple Crown in economics for his work in theory, history, and education. He's taught economics, business, and finance at Columbia Business School and Columbia University. He's worked for the government, the CIA, oh boy, nonprofits, including he was president of FEE, which is the Foundation for Economic Education, and he's been a consultant to IBM and other Fortune 500 companies. He's the author of over 25 books, including The Making of Modern Economics, which I read back in the day when that came out, and The Maxims of Wall Street. He's the editor-in-chief of award-winning investment newsletter, Forecasts and Strategies, since 1980. He's written for the Wall Street Journal and Forbes magazine, and he produces Freedom Fest, which I go to every summer, the world's largest gathering of free minds, usually in Las Vegas. This year it's in Memphis, Tennessee, so check it out. He and his wife, Joanne, whom I know, have 5 children and 8 grandchildren. He's making up for all those less than fecund liberals, I guess. Or something like that. Influenced by his work, The Structure of Production, the federal government began publishing a broader, more accurate measure of the economy, gross output, GO, every quarter, along with GDP. Everybody's familiar with gross domestic product. GDP is the standard measure. Mark has been pioneering and pushing his gross output as a better measure than GDP. We'll get into that later in this conversation. Mark, welcome to the show.
Michael, it's a pleasure. I've listened to a lot of your podcasts, and I'm glad to finally be on your show.
Okay, you're the one that's been listening. All right, good. So let's just start super basic. You have the cover story here. I asked you to, explain to us why economics matters. So just give us your answer. Why should anybody study economics? What's the point? Why do we care?
I was last night. We actually gave the first Doty Spogli Free Enterprise Award to Vernon Smith, and I kind of asked him the same question because he grew up. His mother was a member of the American Socialist Party, and Vernon Smith his first vote in 1948 was for Norman Thomas, the socialist, and his two economics professors at Harvard were Paul Samuelson and Alvin Hansen, who were top Keynesians. So I said, how is it possible? What happened? How did you convert to free market economics with that kind of a background? And he said, it was the study of economics. And what he meant by that was one thing about economics is that you realize right from the beginning that how do you allocate scarce resources? We all have unlimited wants, but the resources to fulfill those wants are limited. And so what is the best arrangement so that you can use these scarce resources in the most productive way? And economics is all about cost benefit. It's all about profit and loss. And it's not just the engineering point of view. And by the way, Vernon Smith started out in engineering, and you and others, it's all the physical sciences and engineering. And engineers built America. There's no question about that. They built the world. But their attitude is, hey, who cares about the cost? If we can do it, let's do it. Let's go to the moon. But the economist is coming along and saying, well, how much is it going to cost us to go to the moon? And what can we use those resources elsewhere? In my Economics for Life, that this Skeptic cover story, I start off with Adam Smith, and Adam Smith came along with this revolutionary idea that if you want to have the fastest, his topic was the wealth of nations. That was the name of his book in 1776, and it was a Declaration of Economic Independence. And basically what he was saying was, instead of the government telling everybody what to do, top-down leadership and identifying where you use these scarce resources, why not let the individual who knows better than the statesman about his own self-interest, why not free up the individual, let the free individual decide where to allocate these resources best? And this was revolutionary because at the time, under mercantilism, the government was really mandating everything. It was mandating wages, where you were going to work. They even mandated required your permission to move from one city to another. That was the way it was back in the 18th century. So Adam Smith advocated a very revolutionary idea: give people maximum freedom under the rules of the game, of the rules of justice, and have a competitive. It's very important to have a competitive model so that you moderate the passions of greed and selfishness and so forth, and you will maximize your standard of living. You will raise the standard of living. And it's very interesting that after 1776, that's really when the Industrial Revolution got started. And I think there's a correlation between this idea of letting people have the freedom to make their own decisions, especially in America. And as a result, we had this tremendous economic growth that took off starting in the early 19th century.
Yeah, you have a nice graph that we now publish in color, because Skeptic's all color in there, showing that takeoff there, and then the other graph here, the decline of poverty as a result of this, right? So Vernon Smith is the Nobel Prize winner in economics. He's one of the prize professors at Chapman, but his comment, his response to your question, what's the value? Why do you embrace free enterprise? And he said, well, because I studied economics. Well, John Maynard Keynes studies economics. You can't tell me that liberal economists who believe in relatively heavy state regulation of the economy don't understand economics. They understand it, right? So why is it that you have liberal left-wing economists and right-wing economists or libertarian economists? You don't see that in physics or engineering or biology. The engineers, physicists, or biologists may have their political leanings, but there's no left-wing physics or right-wing physics. Why is it that way in economics?
Okay, so first of all, I reject entirely the notion of left-wing, right-wing. I never use these terms. We're more interested in what is the science, okay? It doesn't matter. There's not left-wing and right-wing physics. And I believe economics is very much of a science, although it's a very different science. So in Vernon Smith's case, what he discovered, because he took a class from a guy named Edward Chamberlain, and Chamberlain did this exercise at the beginning of each class when he started teaching about monopoly and competition. And he had buyers and sellers, and they would do one exchange. It would be one-on-one, one exchange. And he said, notice that the results were that there were different values, and so the competitive market doesn't work. So capitalism is all about monopoly power. The competitive model that Adam Smith developed doesn't work. Well, he had a defective experiment. And this is where, Vernon Smith is famous for experimental economics. So what he did was he divided the class into buyers and sellers, just like Chamberlain, but they all traded against each other. So instead of having one-on-one trades where you get different results, you had 11 students who were buyers and 11 students who were sellers, and they traded, and they came to an equilibrium price within several trades. And so he realized right then that the competitive model of Adam Smith does in fact work. So just like in physics and in chemistry and in biology, you have differences of opinion and so forth. Through experiment, through analysis, and rather than just kind of high theory, the empirical work is really important. And the empirical work does seem to support free market economics. And even somebody like Paul Samuelson, he had his criticisms of the capitalist model, no question about that. But he said, instead of 3 cheers for capitalism, I'll give you 2 cheers. So in a sense, I think we have moved to quite a bit of a consensus, what we might call a neoclassical consensus, that 90% of economists tend to agree with. And I think that's really a positive move. So it's not left, right, or any of that sort of thing. We're just moving toward a sound view of economics. And if you look at the Adam Smith model, what does it preach? It basically preach voluntarism as much as possible, that individuals and business leaders and workers need to be emboldened as much as possible to make their own decisions. You see this in business all the time. Decentralized decision-making is extremely important. And more businesses are allowing that. The idea of top-down running things, the Soviet model demonstrated quite clearly it could not produce the goods. And I mean, I spent time in the Soviet Union. I visited there before the collapse. And there was you went into the grocery store and there was black bread. It was really nice, but it was the only bread. You didn't have any choice. And they had shortages, and they had too much of one thing and not enough of another. You go into a grocery store today, and the quantity, quality, and variety of goods and services is mind-boggling. Maybe even too much choice. So what is the criticism of capitalism? Well, okay, inequality. You can argue about inequality and redistribution of income and so forth. But you don't want to pluck the golden goose too much, because if you do, the result is going to be a disaster. I would like to mention also, because I have this in the article in the Skeptic cover story, and that's the Economic Freedom Index. The evidence is really overwhelming that if you give people more freedom, they grow faster and they have a higher standard of living. So you have countries in the West, and Singapore is number one right now. Hong Kong used to be number one for 40 years, but of course the communist Chinese have come in and destroyed the Hong Kong model tragically. But, if you look at economic growth, it's the Western countries that have the most freedom. They're growing the most. They have the highest standard of living. So there's some criticisms of excessive economic growth, inequality, and so forth. But those are really on the margin. I think overall economists are coming to a consensus, as they have in other sciences, of what is the best formula for economic success and the wealth of nations.
I guess it must depend on what the goal is. I guess if you want to increase per capita GDP in a country, here are the dozen things you should do, give people more freedom and, deregulate business and things like that. So, but much of it, it depends on maybe political decisions. Like, what's the right upper income tax rate? It used to be 70% something back in the 50s, right? And then Reagan famously reduced it, and it's now in the 30s. But what's the right number? Well, there is no right number, right? That depends on who's in political office that kind of makes those decisions.
I think one of the problems, Michael, is that you're kind of at sea without rudder with the progressive income tax. I mean, what is the highest rate and so forth? Adam Smith advocated a simple, easy to understand, where you can compute the tax, and it minimizes the impact on production and incentives and so forth. And so that was the movement toward lowering the tax rate and broadening the base. If you look at any of these countries that have adopted a flat tax, it's not like revenues have declined. Tax revenues have actually gone up because production has been stimulated. I mean, Russia adopted, they started off after the Soviet Union collapsed. The Russian government decided to engage in a typical progressive tax. And they had huge tax evasion, especially by the Russian mafia. They just didn't pay any tax at all. So they went to a 13% flat tax, simple 13% flat tax. And the Russian mafia started paying taxes because it wasn't worth engaging in a underground economy, engaging in illegal activity at 13%. But if it was at 70%, then they would. You also notice that a lot of places where they have adopted these high tax rates on the state level, you're seeing a lot of movement out of those states to the lower tax states. And California, New York, all of them are seeing people leaving those states. In the same time, countries that have adopted a very high progressive and wealth tax are seeing wealthy people move out of those countries. Norway, for example, just recently adopted a wealth tax. Norwegians are moving now out of the country, some of the wealthiest people. And so you have a wealth drain, if you will. Maybe not a brain drain, but at least a wealth drain.
But just a point of clarification, when you talk about these upper income tax rates, that's just for the money made above a certain level, right? So if you make, the first 100,000 is taxed at X percent, and then the next 100,000 is slightly higher, and then the next 100,000 after that is higher still. So it's not like half of your income or 70% of all of your income is taken through taxes, right?
Yeah, it's the marginal tax rate. But look, if you make $1 million in California, you're paying on the entire amount 13%.
Mm, right.
Okay, so it's not like, well, you're just paying 2% on the 100,000, and then it's actually a 13% rate on all of your income if you've made over $1 million in California. So this is why Elon Musk and others have left California to states like Texas and
Yeah.
Florida and what have you.
It's just too expensive, right? Well, de-incentivizes their creativity and drive. That's the argument. Now, the counter argument to that is that people like Elon can afford to pay more, a higher percentage of their tax. So an extra dollar to somebody that makes $10 a week or $10 a day or whatever, that's a lot compared to an extra dollar for someone like Elon.
Yeah, it's the ability to pay argument. And I think I think you have to look beyond that. There's no question that they have the ability to pay more tax. However, I would warn that this is a tax on capital. It is capital that drives the economy. It's capital. It's the supply side. It's entrepreneurship. It's innovation. It's capital. It's savings. It's investment. It's entrepreneurship, all on the supply side. And one of the reasons America has been exceptional, American exceptionalism, is because we attract those kinds of entrepreneurs. And Elon Musk is not born in the United States; he's from South Africa. And Natella, for example, who runs Microsoft, he's Indian. There's a lot of these people that have come to the United States because people know that if they become successful, they can keep that money and they can keep their entrepreneur spirit going. I think it's when you tax capital, either on a wealth tax, capital gains tax, income tax, it's all taxing capital. It's saving. The wealthiest people save the most. And so you have this pool of capital, and it's being drained every year. That sucking sound is going to Washington, and that money never comes back. And it's also going from the productive use, because most people agree private enterprise uses capital more productively, toward the unproductive sector. Government uses money to do all kinds of things that are expensive and wasteful. We do not have cheap government. And so that's going to foreign wars. It's going to foreign aid. It's going to welfare recipients who are paid not to work. It goes to bridges to nowhere. It goes to pet projects, earmarks that are now back in vogue. In the capital markets, the biggest capital market is the Treasury market. It's considered the safest, and it's the biggest capital market in the world. And what is that money used for? And yet it attracts investors who are constantly putting money into that. And yes, government can do certain things well. They certainly should do things that private enterprise can't do very well. But it's expensive. I give a quote from Ben Franklin, who said, "A virtuous and industrious people may be cheaply governed." And so I ask people when I talk about Ben Franklin, I said, okay, do we have cheap government, or is government expensive? And it's interesting that whether you're Republican or Democrat, it doesn't matter what your political views are, government is expensive. Everybody realizes government is expensive. Does it really cost us? I mean, should we really pay 50% of our income to get what we get from government in terms of national defense, rule of law, all of these rules and regulations? No, we should be paying maybe 20%. Maybe we should go back to the old tithing principle of 10%, and which is something that is easy to calculate. Here's another example. Do you know when the last time Hong Kong actually changed their tax law? 60, 70 years ago. When do we change our tax laws? Every 3 or 4
election,
years.
Yeah.
Every 3 or 4 years. Now, of course, Hong Kong is not a democracy. We are.
But that's my point with the left wing, right wing thing, right? It comes from the top. You have a Republican administration. They lower taxes, deregulate business, and so forth. Most of what Trump did along those lines was just standard Republican GOP stuff. And then the Dems get in there and they raise it and change it and so on. That's just kind of normal how it goes in America. But you picked some of the, the worst examples of government overspending for sure. But, to channel Barack Obama when he said, you didn't build that speech, and, conservative heads exploded when he said that. But, of course, what he meant was, the Google employees all drive to work on public roads that the government built. They're on land that the government protects and provides a military to defense and a police department and stuff. If we didn't have those things, we'd just be invaded and some other country would be running us and they would tax you. So you're going to pay taxes either way. And, the kind of infrastructure, yes, there are bridges to nowhere. Yeah, okay. But there are bridges we need, bridges that go somewhere. Most of them go somewhere, right? So, Naomi Oreskes, I don't know if you listen to my podcast with her, the Big Myth is her book showing how, free market enterprise does not solve a lot of social problems. It just can't. The electrification of rural America did not happen without the government, particularly Roosevelt coming in and going, this is what we're going to do, and we will help you do this, because the electricity companies at the time said, we don't want to take electric wires and telephone poles and so on to these rural areas because there's only one farmer down the road, and it's just not worth it for us. We can't afford it. And so, the electrification of the entire country is good for America. It's good for everybody. It increases the average GDP of the entire country in the long run if everyone has electricity, and the free market is not going to do that without some government encouragement or subsidies or I don't know what.
So, Michael, I'm certainly in agreement with you on the idea that government is necessary. I'm not an anarchist along the lines of Murray Rothbard or David Friedman or what have you. In fact, I've argued for the case for government in many cases. And look, government has done some things that are really essential. There's no question about it. But how do they do that? In other words, are there market principles that government can adopt that will minimize this expense that government is required? So outsourcing is a classic example. Do you want the local government, for example, to do the garbage collection? No, you want a private firm to go around and you outsource it and you do competitive bidding. Do you want the government to build the roads? Well, the government really isn't building the roads except out in California here, where it's a government agency that builds roads. And by the way, I've noticed that there's a lot of potholes out here in California. Mm-hmm. If you notice just driving, even on some of the interstate, it's just, I just went to Claremont the other day and there are potholes everywhere. And I found out that it's a government agency that does this instead of outsourcing and so forth. These are good ways to save a lot of money. Let me give you another example. Social Security and Medicare have a huge unfunded liability problem because retirees are getting older. The investment in the Social Security Trust Fund is in T-bills instead of the S&P 500. So it's a bad system. It could be improved a lot. Private enterprise solved this problem, the unfunded liability, over the last 30 years by switching from defined benefit plans, which is what Social Security is, where you define what the benefit is at the end, instead of what the defined contribution plan is, what you put into it initially. And so almost every private company has gone from defined benefit plans to defined contribution plans, 401k plans, and so forth, where individuals are in charge of that. The result, people are much better off. They're forced to be good stewards of their own money, which they do better than when other people. But
hang on one second, Mark. Hang on one second.
Yeah.
What you're talking about here is where corporations set this up for their employees. We know from research that most people, whether they're dependent on the government or the corporation they work for, they're not very good at this. So you have this paternalistic, libertarian paternalism, right? This kind of nudging people where we know people are terrible at long-term investments and discounting the future and so on. And so the company will say, look, here are 5 investment plans. You can pick any one of the 5, but we're going to take the money out of your paycheck because we know if we depend on you to do it, you're not going to do it. You're just going to spend the money.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate of the nudge libertarian paternalism.
Oh, you are? Okay, good.
Oh, yeah. What Richard Thaler did, where he said, well, he basically didn't really force people to invest in a 401k. What he basically said was, you will automatically be connected with the 401k plan unless you opt out. And that switched. It used to be 20% would sign up. Now 80% signed up. Mm-hmm. And then you do give limits. So you're not allowing people to use their 401k money to buy penny stocks. They buy index funds, and some of them are bond funds. Some of them are stock funds. You protect them to some extent from their stupidity, and that's very useful. So again, we're using market principles to improve our outcome when it comes to government and so forth. James Buchanan, who is the economist who developed public choice, is a very important economist here. He won the Nobel Prize in 1982, and he said, listen, almost every state has a balanced budget amendment. And it's been very useful to control the debt levels of states. We need this on a federal level, and we also need a tax limitation amendment so that they don't just raise taxes to control the budget. So there's lots of things that can be done. Outsourcing is another example of where government really benefits. You notice that our defense spending is done by private companies, right? We don't have a government agency that's building airplanes, mm-hmm. But countries that did do that found it to be a disaster. So there's lots of ways that we can improve government with market principles, and that's really what I'm advocating here.
Mm-hmm. Right. So let's look at some of these questions you asked. Economics Made Simple. There's our opening questions here. Should valuable goods and services such as college education, medical services, and transportation be made available to the public for free? That's one of those things you hear a lot. That just seems like it should be a right. Healthcare should be a right, just like roads are a right or public schools are a right, that kind of thing. How far do you take that?
Well, again, I think there's some violation of market principles here that we really need to take into account. Let's just take schooling, free college education as an example. Whenever you give something that's a valuable commodity like education or medical expenses for free, you create unintended consequences, and there's lots of distortions that are affected. For example, a study was found that students who actually pay for part or all of their education, they choose their major quicker, they get better grades, and they graduate faster. Why? Because there's an incentive. There's a self-interested incentive to do that. Otherwise, people don't really appreciate the value of the education they're getting. So I'm not against scholarships and other and aid and so forth, although the student loan situation is a very dangerous situation because it's sold as student aid rather than an actual loan that you have to pay back. I saw a study recently that showed what sectors of the economy have the highest rise in the cost of living or the cost expense and so forth, and what has the lowest. And of course, automobiles were cheaper in real terms, and food and so forth. But the two areas where the costs rose the most were education and medical. And those are both of them which have a third-party problem. What is the third-party problem? The third-party problem is someone else pays. It violates the accountability principle in economics. The accountability principle says you pay. You go into the grocery store, you buy a loaf of bread, you pay for it. Now, if someone else is paying for it, if your parents are paying for it, students, and I have lots of students who have been given debit cards and credit cards by their parents, and I said, do you know what the price of food What's the price of a loaf of bread? They didn't know because they weren't paying for a price of loaf of bread. I asked them, what was the cost of a single stamp in the post office? One of them said $5.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And it's, it's 90 some cents. Of course, it says forever on it now, so nobody even knows what it is.
Right.
But this is a problem with education being free. It's very dangerous. Now, sure, we want to help people out. I like the school voucher idea. Even Adam Smith advocated public education so that everybody's on some kind of a level playing field. And so I agree with that. But what's the best way to promote public education? And I think school choice and vouchers is a great way. That's a market solution to this problem. We need to think more and more in terms of market solutions to our problems. Same thing with medical services. We'll switch to that. I'm a big fan of Sean Flynn. Sean Flynn is the professor of economics at Scripps College. He's written a book called Economics for Dummies, but he's also the number one, he's the primary writer for the McConnell Brew Flynn textbook, a very popular economics textbook. Well, he's written a book, The Cure That Works, and he talks about the Singapore system, the Singapore model, which has health savings accounts, so that you are encouraged to shop around when you're using the services of a dentist or a doctor's visit to get an annual exam and so forth. But for catastrophic expenses, that's paid for through a government program, so that it's a nice combination of using market principles to solve the healthcare problem, instead of doing the universal single payer system, which is socialized medicine, where you violate it's the third party principle. You violate the market principle of the user pay, and as a result, Singapore has first class healthcare at 4.5% of GDP, while we spend 18% of our GDP on medical expenses, largely because someone else is always paying. And so the costs and fraud and deception and all the problems with medical services seem to be a problem. So he's written a whole book on the Singapore system, and we're having him come into my class at Chapman on Monday talking about that, as well as global warming and some of the other hot topics.
I've seen examples of this in just going to different medical providers, and when you see what they actually bill the insurance companies, it's just astonishing. The example I use is I was having some problems with my thumbs. I have a little arthritis here, right? So when I moved to Santa Barbara, I went to a hand specialist, and he gave me the whole thing. Well, we can do the surgery and this. I'm like, I don't want to cut up my hands. What other solutions do you have? Well, we have these thumb braces, right? So it was just a very simple thing, like a neoprene foam, like a wetsuit kind of material that just wraps around the thumb and the wrist. To me, it looked like it probably cost $1 to make. And so he gave me a pair. And I said, oh, thanks. I said, well, I'm a cyclist and I ride every day and it's going to get all sweaty. Can I have a second pair? Oh, yeah, no problem. Here's a second pair. And then I got the bill through my provider, Blue Shield, and the cost of one of these was like $1,500. And so I actually blew the whistle on this guy, and I called Blue Shield. I said, do you know what this? I looked up the company. I got the box. I looked up the company name on the box, and I went online, and I could have bought it online. It was like $17. This guy was charging, I don't think it was $1,500. It was like $750. Yeah, $1,500 for the two pair. And I thought, okay, who's paying for this? This guy is just totally ripping off. I don't know if it's Blue Shield that's getting ripped off or some government agency. I don't know enough about how it works, but obviously somebody's just raking it in. That's just, why is that not illegal? Why aren't there more checks and balances? Is this the problem you're talking about?
And so the problem is that you didn't pay for it, right? Someone else paid for it. It's right. The third party. It's called the third party problem in economics, and it violates the user pay concept. and we see this all the time. We need to connect the benefits with the expenses. And the closer you can connect them, the better. And this is the biggest problem with government is that here's a classic example. Who builds a stadium? Who builds a sports stadium in a town?
Yes,
okay,
right.
It turns out that 90%, 95% are all by the city through taxpayers, and some of them even have tourist tax to pay for something that the tourists don't go to, except maybe a few of them, and it's maybe a local. So someone else is paying. You're disconnecting the beneficiary and the payer. You need to connect the two. So I always bring out the examples of the AT&T Stadium, which may have changed this in the Bell Stadium in San Francisco, the baseball stadium, which was. The city did donate the property, but everything else was funded by the corporate owners, by the fans who actually come to the game. Why don't we just have everybody come to a game for free? We should offer it for free. Well, no, we don't. The user pays, and you get more out of the game because the fans are coming because they realize this is the value I paid for it, and it was worth going to. You get more out of it.
But as I understand it, most stadiums and sporting venues are heavily subsidized by local governments because in the long run, it's gonna pay off. More people will come, more people will use the restaurants and hotels and so on, and they'll all pay more taxes because they're making more money, right? So I had a funny little, I didn't have an exchange, I just tweeted at Elon because he famously a couple of days ago said something like, NPR is just government. It's just government media because they get subsidized by the government. Well, it turns out it's like 2% of their budget is paid for by the government, right? Or I saw some different calculations, maybe 4%, but it's tiny. And then I just remembered, well, I have a Tesla. When I bought my Tesla in 2018, I got a $7,500 tax break from the IRS, and I actually got a $2,500 check from the state of California. They mailed me a check, so I got $10,000 worth of subsidies. Now I got the
sports car, my friend.
Yeah, I got the benefit, but doesn't Elon and doesn't Tesla get the benefit because that knocks $10,000 off the price of the car? Am I a government affiliated car driver now?
These are expensive sports cars for wealthy people like you who drive
but
around.
I'm not wealthy.
Yeah, but if you bought a Tesla, you are wealthy. Don't give me this nonsense, Michael. These cars cost a lot of money, and they shouldn't be subsidized. And that's the
why
thing.
Does the government do that?
Yeah, but I want to get back to the sports example. I don't know of a single sports stadium owner who didn't sell his property for huge profits at the end of the time. So none of the subsidies is necessary at all. So we can just save some money here. We don't have to think in terms of, well, we need to do this to stimulate the local economy and so forth. It'll be stimulated anyway. Everybody will win without the subsidies, and the San Francisco Stadium demonstrates that's the case. We need more people who take a class in economics and understand these basic cost benefit analysis. Is the way I look at it.
Well, let me just come back to back to Elon, he got different bids from different states to build his battery factory, right? And I think where did he end up in Nevada? Because they said, well, you don't have to pay any taxes here for the first 20 years or whatever. Why do state governments do that? Well, they want the business there because in the long run, they'll get more taxes and it'll pay off. That's why they do it, right?
Yeah, so but at least they're trying to do a cost benefit analysis because they're giving up a lot of tax revenues. There are some cities who just refuse to do that. So it does vary from place to place, but countries do it as well. I do like the idea of competition between tax jurisdictions. I think that's really a good idea, and that's one reason that has kept tax rates low from one country to another. Corporate income tax was reduced to 21% in the United States, mainly because Canada had a 12% tax rate, Ireland had a 4% tax rate. All these countries were reducing their tax rates to encourage more development. So the competitive model that Adam Smith's talking about can work for government as well.
When you talk about the comparative method, comparing different countries that have different tax rates or different economic policies, and we can see the outcome, are those really pretty good experiments that, like, say, if you created a new country and said, let's say you're going to create a new country on Mars, what system should we set up? Well, let's look at all the different countries, 200 countries in on Earth. Which ones have the most productive tax policies or economic policies or whatever? Which countries do you point to and go, yeah, we should do more of that and less of this other?
Well, Hong Kong is the classic example. I mentioned before that they haven't changed their tax law since 1960. So you want to have business really needs to know so that they can do long-term planning. The tax policy is extremely important. The other thing that I think is important is a tax rate that stays relatively stable. Now, in case of Hong Kong, they have a combination of a flat tax and a progressive tax. So it starts out at 2%, but the maximum rate is 16.5%. So that seems like kind of a flat tax with a increase. And they haven't changed it in 50 or 60 years. So a lot of planning can be involved with that. They also have no tax on interest, dividends, or capital gains. So that means they don't tax capital at all. So capital can go to its most efficient use. You don't have to worry about the tax consequences, short-term or long-term, and that money is really sent out. They don't even have a sales tax in Hong Kong, which is kind of surprising. So they have a very simple system. And I like Steve Forbes' idea of tax, filling out the tax form on a postcard, if we could simplify it. But unfortunately, our tax code is monstrous, extremely complex, and every time we change it, it's becoming more and more difficult. The print on the 1040 is getting smaller and smaller. They have to put in all kinds of exemptions and stuff. I can't do my own tax returns. I have a professional do my own tax returns. And it's not like I'm really a dumb guy. It's just that I need to, you choose your comparative advantage, right?
Mm. Yeah, but you have people like Warren Buffett who says, I should be paying more taxes, but the system is set up in such a way that I have to just use it and rig it up, so I have to pay less taxes. My secretary pays more taxes than me. He means percentage-wise. Why is that happening?
Well, again, it's we have different tax rates for different groups and corporations versus the corporate tax rate in Hong Kong is virtually the same as the individual. So there's no advantage to creating your own corporation to dodge the taxes and so forth. I think Warren Buffett is a little disingenuous because there's nothing keeping him from writing a check for billions of dollars if he thinks wealthy people should pay more. And he should go around like they do with the gifting pledge of 50%. Well, why don't they do that for the income tax? It needs to be as voluntary as possible instead of forcing rich people. A lot of rich people don't want to give the money to the government because it's money that goes and never comes back. You write that check, and I've written a check for $250,000 to the IRS. And let me tell you, my hand was shaking because I knew that I could have used that money for a lot of productive uses, and instead it's going to fight a foreign war.
Yeah, the war thing. Let's leave that aside because I agree with you on that. That just seems like an utter waste of money and resources. What was those missiles that we were firing at the Chinese balloon? Like each of them was $500,000. It's just how is that even possible? Like each jet sortie, the jet fuel alone is like tens of thousands of dollars to launch a single plane for one sortie. Yeah, it's astonishing. Then I saw something the other day about the price of diesel fuel that we're charging Ukraine and our support was like $400 a gallon. All right, so somebody's making some big money in the interim there, in between.
Yeah, well, Eisenhower wisely warned against the industrial military complex. There's no question about that. And it's also in the pharmaceutical industry and a lot of other areas where you do have the crony capitalism problem. And Adam Smith warned about it. We have a lot of things that we could do better. Our banking system is really kind of screwed up because we have all this fractional reserve banking. We just went through a banking crisis, mainly because the Federal Reserve, which is a major source of instability in this country, is constantly jumping from easy money to tight money to easy money to tight money. And as I've said directly to Fed chairmen when they come to the economics meetings, I said, why can't we have a stable monetary policy where you just have not tight money, not easy money, but just sound money? Can't we just do something like that? And of course, they have too much power and they have something to do. And so they raise interest rates and then they lower interest rates and they increase the money supply and they decrease the money supply and they have quantitative easing and quantitative reduction. It's a very dangerous game, in my opinion, and I think it's been very costly in terms of people's unemployment, recession, jobs, businesses going under. It's a great tragedy.
Yeah. Let's come back to that in a second, but two fun examples. So when I saw Ed Snowden on Joe Rogan's show, from a remote location in Moscow, he was explaining to Joe how conspiracies really work. Joe loves conspiracy theories, and Snowden worked in the government. So he says, let me tell you, it's not like some cigarette smoking guys behind closed doors trying to run the world. They're just bureaucrats trying to keep their job, and they have to maintain this kind of threat of terrorism, or else if they say we solve the terrorism problem, then their budgets are going to be cut, and then they're going to lose their jobs, and so on. Second example was Fred Kaplan, the journalist that has written much about nuclear weapons and the Cold War and all that. He pointed out that there was two arms races, one between the United States and the USSR, the other one between the three branches of military within the United States, each of whom wanted their own nuclear weapons. This is how we ended up with the triad. The Army wanted their nukes, the Navy wanted their nukes, and the Air Force wanted their nukes. So you have to have bomber planes with nuclear weapons, missiles on land, and then missiles in submarines. And the reason we have that is because each of the branches lobbied Congress to get more money. And that even worse was that they have to keep building these weapons because otherwise the budgets get cut, right? So you have to charge the government for these weapons that you're making. But what are you going to do with all those weapons? Well, we have to have them targeted at different locations in the USSR. Okay, so Kaplan had this example of some obscure Air Force base in the middle of nowhere in Siberia that's frozen over 10 months out of the year. It's completely worthless, but we had 24 nuclear weapons targeted there. Why? Because you have to put down on paper what the weapons are going to be used for, or else Congress is going to say, why are we spending all this money? Right? So it really comes down to just individual incentive to keep their jobs and keep their budgets.
I used to, for the last 10 years, I've asked my students at Chapman, and I do it anonymously on Zoom, which is great. And I said, so how many of you think you're going to see nuclear war in your lifetime? And 10 years ago, I couldn't get any hands to go up. Today, 40% of their hands are going up. So they're definitely, and of course, a lot of it has to do with Russia threatening to use nuclear weapons. Yeah. And whoever thought that, no matter when you create a new weapon, you're going to use it at some point or another. I mean, it's there. And so it's some crazy kook out there. And we're getting crazier and crazier people running our government. That's for sure. I mean, you really wonder at what point is somebody going to accidentally push a button, which we've come close to doing back in the 80s and so forth. I think there was a case where the Russians thought that there was an attack, and they were.
There's been a bunch of those, yes.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. No, so that sort of thing is really scary.
Petrov is the guy that the Soviet officer who was on duty when he saw the radar light up and thought, could be a incoming first strike from the United States. Turns out it wasn't, and he correctly rejected that and saved the world. There's a documentary on Netflix called The Man Who Saved the World about that. In any case, okay, so let's bring up two things, banking and then inflation. So explain to us I never even heard of the Silicon Valley Bank, but explain to us how a bank run like that could happen. They're so well funded and they're investing and making all this money and so on. Then all of a sudden, boom! I thought the FDIC guaranteed that wouldn't happen.
Yeah, so of course, FDIC insures up to $250,000. Started off at only $5,000 or $10,000, but it's moved up with inflation. But in Silicon Valley's case, apparently over 90% of all the depositors in the bank were wealthy people who were involved with the Silicon Valley, hence the name and the technology and so forth. And they were heavy into funding a lot of these high-risk tech companies. So meanwhile, where do you invest this money? Well, you invest it in two parts. You invest in these IPOs and these new companies, which are risky, and then you invest the rest of it in government securities. Every bank is required by the prudent man rule to have the majority of their assets in government bonds because they're AAA. But those bonds fell 30% in the last year. So that created a situation where normally it's a source of, we had a 40-year bull market in treasury bonds. Interest rates went down for 40 years. It was a no-brainer to invest in government securities. But this last year was down 30%. Because of the Fed's aggressive raising of rates, and there's unintended consequences when you do that. And so you're now facing any kind of withdrawals, especially from somebody like Peter Thiel, for example, who took out $50 million worth in his capital investment. That's going to create a real problem with how do you pay for that? How do you sell off and create and give him a check for $50 million. So the end result was they were basically insolvent because of it. So, and that spread from other banks. And there's other banks out there that face the very same problem because the Fed's decision to raise rates affected all of these portfolios and all of these banks. So there's an instability factor there when you've had 10 years, let's see, since 2009, we had 2008, we had an easy money policy, and we cut interest rates to zero. We had the ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, and that creates a lot of bubbles in the economy. You're going to invest when you can't get any money on a CD and so on. Where are you going to invest it? You're going to invest in the stock market, because they have dividend-paying stocks that I've even recommended myself that pay 5, 6, 7, sometimes over 10%. So you're going to invest in more risky investments, and so a stock market crash or bear market is also vulnerable. So there's a lot of factors because we live in a laissez-faire financial system, and it's global now. We used to have all kinds of capital controls on shifting of money. But now, just with the push of a button on your computer, you can sell everything. And that creates the possibility of these kinds of crises that are going to come on. So the most recent crisis will not be the last. It's just part of our system. And let me just tell you one other thing that's worth pointing out. Canada not a single bank has failed in Canada in 100 years. And you know why? Not because it's totally government controlled, but because they allow nationwide branching a lot sooner than we ever did. Nationwide branching is a relatively new phenomenon in the United States. And that really helps one sector to offset the other. It creates
what does that mean, nationwide branching? You mean like I have a Bank of America in every city?
Yeah, exactly. Which you do have now, but you didn't have 30 or 50 or 60 years ago. And that's why we had over 10,000 individual banks and very few branches. And it created all kinds of bankruptcies and so forth, while Canada has six banks, national banks across the country, and they've never had the financial crisis that that we face. So there's a lot we can learn from looking at what other countries do in terms of stable banking policy. But the Federal Reserve is definitely an engine of inflation. Its original goal was to defend the dollar and defend the gold standard. But it's interesting that ever since we went off the gold standard, there's a fascinating study by a couple of Harvard economists, Reinhold and Rogoff, who showed that except for war, from 1776 to World War II, we had relatively stable price inflation. It would only go up during wartime when we'd go off the gold standard. Then when we went off the gold standard in 1933 and again and completely in 1971 under Nixon, so FDR took us off the gold standard in the U.S. Nixon took us off the gold standard internationally. Ever since then, inflation has taken off and has never looked back. So Rogoff and Reinhardt he said, we lost our discipline. We lost our discipline to control the money supply and engage in this tight money, easy money policy ever since World War II. Okay,
there's a lot to unpack there. Without gold as a standard, why? What is the value of money? You often hear this term fiat money. What does that mean? The government, the United States government itself is the equivalent of gold. It's just saying we're a sound government, and as long as we tell you the money is valuable, it is.
Well, and if you have a problem to avoid just printing money to pay for government programs, the government says, listen, we can tax our people, we can borrow the money and pay interest rates because we're in good, sound condition. We have a bunch of gold in Fort Knox and to back up and so on. So there's a lot to be said for that. But the biggest, I often ask my students, so we went off the gold standard and we didn't have hyperinflation that a lot of gold bugs predicted. Why is that? What took the place of gold as the discipline to keep the Federal Reserve and the government in control? And of course, they don't know an answer. And so finally, I have to tell them, I said, well, it's the bond and the stock markets because they don't like inflation. Bond market certainly doesn't like inflation because it makes it harder for them to sell their bonds. So that's the new discipline. The problem is it's not as good a discipline as the gold standard. And so that's why we continue to have small amounts of inflation. But the problem is that we can still end up like a Venezuela and some of these countries where they just lose complete control of discipline and we've had a number of episodes of hyperinflation in the 20th century, and it's all dealing with fiat money once you went off the gold standard.
Well, since you run Freedom Fest, you attract some of these far extreme anarcho-capitalists and the doomsayers and the preppers, right? They're buying their gold and guns and their bomb shelters in Idaho or whatever, talking about the economy is going to collapse and the mobs are going to come to your house and so on. So you got to protect your family and have gold.
Come on, Michael, that's not Freedom Fest.
No, but you do get some of those people. I'm just saying that there are
because we're a big tent. We're a big tent, and hopefully they're within the tent and not outside the tent.
Yeah. No, this question is not about Freedom Fest. It's about those people. So that's not impossible. It happened in Venezuela, right? Or it has happened. It seems unlikely to happen in the United States as long as we're like the top most powerful, wealthy country ever on the planet. Not impossible, but not likely, right? And is that just because of the government? It could happen if we didn't have a stable government.
So what we're seeing is a movement toward the Venezuelan model, but way far. I mean, it's not anywhere close to it, but we are sowing the seeds of runaway inflation. When you look at the Federal Reserve balance sheet and this quantitative easing, so what they did in 2008, this is new, where they went directly, instead of going through the banks, they went directly to the Treasury and they bought securities directly from the Treasury to keep that market up.
Who's they?
And they went, huh?
Who's they?
The Federal Reserve.
Oh, the Federal Reserve. Okay.
Yeah, the Federal Reserve. And then they bought all these mortgages, these subprime mortgages that were securitized during 2007, 2008, and so forth, to keep the real estate market from collapsing any further. Well, they put on their balance sheet $4 trillion worth of debt, and they tried to start paying off of that when the good times came back, which is what they should be doing, but they didn't get anywhere close. And during this banking crisis, it's reversed, and quantitative easing has gone up dramatically because the Fed panicked. The Fed panics a lot. They're very calm when Jay Powell and Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke, they always choose these people, Janet Yellen, they're very quiet and so forth, and that's on purpose. But the fact is, in the backseat, which they're scared to death of some of the things that are happening. And so they moved very quickly on this latest banking crisis, but quantitative easing went up dramatically. And the discount window, which is where banks can borrow money overnight and for short periods of time because of liquidity problems, that amount of money in the discount window went up higher than the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. So there was a lot going on behind the scenes, what my concern is that we've kind of built in inflation into our system, and we had licked inflation. We were down to very low levels, and now the cat is out of the bag, and now we're back into this problem, and it's much more difficult to deal with once inflation gets started. It's what Hayek called a tiger by the tail. So I'm hoping the Fed can control things, but I am concerned considering the national debt going through the roof. And on the fiscal side, the government is just going nutso on expenses. They see a program and they're just throwing money at it. And I think that's a very scary scenario when you have no discipline. You have no discipline left in under the Biden administration, and frankly, under the Trump administration, you didn't have much discipline there either, because the debt grew pretty rapidly under Trump, just like it did.
Doesn't it do that under all administrations? I mean, Reagan grew the government more than anybody else.
The only exception is Bill Clinton in the second half, balanced budget, and that's because he worked with Newt Gingrich and the Republicans. They worked together, and in a sense, at cross purposes, but it turned out really well where they were starting to run surpluses, and then, of course, 9/11 hit, and George W. Bush, who was a very weak president, came in and started expanding government, and then you had So I tell my students there's 3 reasons why government keeps growing and growing and growing almost out of control. One is never-ending wars. That always causes big government spending. Number 2 is depressions, recessions, crises. That always causes government to stimulate and expand under the Keynesian model. And the third one is growing regulations, and we're seeing this now. Regulations are just mind-boggling with the EPA, the global warming thing. It's just never ending. We're getting to the point where Adam Smith was in 1776, railing against all of these rules and regulations that were strangling the economy. This is my biggest danger. Sorry, we're in a slow growth economy. We're not growing hardly at all anymore. And it's a direct causation of excessive government that's unproductive.
Can you explain why the Fed is raising interest rates to get inflation to go down? Do we know for sure that there's a causal? Is this like a law of physics? It should work?
It all depends. You have to have both. You have to control both the supply of money and the price of money. So they're raising. All the headlines are the rise in the interest rates, the price of money. So that's only one of the other tool. The other tool is the money supply, and they are tightening the money supply. It grew at 40% in 2020 and 2021 because of the COVID, reaction to the COVID and the lockdown. So not only was the Trump administration and then Biden administration giving out a lot of free money, but the Federal Reserve was pumping money into the system and increased the money supply 40%. So the result was inflation. And you had the supply side, the supply chain shortages as well, which, by the way, we should talk about gross output because that measures the supply chain, which is really important. So with all of this going on, yes, I think the Fed is really doing its best, giving its restrictions to bring inflation down, and inflation is coming down. The evidence is that it's slowing and coming back down. But it's being countered by fiscal policy, by the Biden administration spending money like water. So it's going to take a while for this inflation to come down. And I don't think it's ever going to come down to zero anymore. It's going to come down, but whether it comes down to that 2% target, I wonder.
So back in 08, 09, the big meltdown, was that not the result of a lack of regulation and oversight in the financial industries who were incentivized to invest in these high-risk collateral, what was it, CDO? Collateral debt obligations, and these bundled mortgages, and giving mortgages to people that had no credit at all, next to no income. I mean, it's just crazy stories of, people that make no money and were able to get mortgages, right, on these variable interest rates, and with their inability to to project themselves into the future and what's going to happen 10 years from now or whatever, won't be able to afford this. But you can hardly blame, here's how I think about it, like a sports analogy. You can hardly blame athletes for trying to do the best they can and win. That's their job. Without referees and rules that are enforced, they're just going to do whatever they can do. So, and if the system is set up that way, it's not that the system is corrupt. It's that's what without government saying you can't do this, they're just going to do whatever they can to make more money. That's literally their job, right? So there's an example of where you really need to regulate the financial industry.
Well, there's no question that there's this blame game, and you do have some economists and a lot of Democrats who blame the deregulatory environment. I think it's a combination of that and government. It's kind of a mixture, magic elixir of these two factors. So first of all, you had government who were loosening the rules, and they did this especially because of redlining. They were concerned that minorities were not getting mortgages and were not getting to own homes and stuff like that. So they have FHA loans that were practically zero mortgage and nothing down, these kinds of things. And you had the Community Reinvestment Act that said banks, you have to, a certain percent of your mortgages have to go to low-income people that don't really qualify. So the prudent man rule was thrown out the window. And by the way, this only occurred in the United States and the UK. It did not occur anywhere else in the world. No one else had a real estate problem with subprime mortgages and no doc loans. This was only the United States. It was not in Canada. It was not in Australia. It was not in Singapore. It was not even in France. It was only the United States and the UK, and that's where the trouble began. So yes, private enterprise took advantage of that, and they came up. Wall Street was very clever with their coming up with the securitizing mortgages and packaging these subprime to reduce the risk, and then they sold them worldwide. All around the world, so it was definitely a combination of bad business and bad government combined. And in fact, when I was serious. I got a chance to interview and ask some questions to Ben Bernanke. I still remember Ben Bernanke in January of 2007 at the AEA meetings, giving a talk called "Bank Regulation." That was the title. And he gave this really boring speech. But I noticed he was using the words panic and crisis over and over again in his speech. So I went and circled how many times he said crisis and panic, and it was 34 times in this talk in January of 2007. He knew what was coming, and he did nothing about it. These people should have been held responsible. He should have been fired, just like any CEO of a bank would have been fired for allowing the subprime loans. But I will give credit to John Allison of BB&T Bank, which is now Truist Bank. He created the largest bank in the South with BB&T Bank, which is now Truist. And he didn't allow any subprime loans. None whatsoever. And in fact, he made money in 2008. He was one of the very few banks, but he was forced to take TARP money because, as Ben Bernanke told him, he said, listen, everybody has to take this money because if you don't take the money, then that shows you that you were sound and the others were unsound, and we can't have that. So he's one of my heroes, is Allison, who later became president of the Cato Institute and now teaches at down in North Carolina. So a great story there. Show you that we didn't have to be this way.
Right. One of the things you often hear in response to all that is modern monetary theory. I don't really know what this is, but it's offered as a solution. As long as the U.S. government's backing the money, we can spend all the money we want on infrastructure, healthcare, whatever, and it's never going to collapse. What do you think as a professional economist? Modern monetary theory.
Yeah, and it's kind of a nice sounding word and everything, but it's extremely dangerous. It's basically what we call crude Keynesian model that was during the Great Depression, that you could spend all the money you want. You can print as much money as you want because you owe it to yourself. And as long as you have the ability to tax, then you can expand to the point where you reach full employment. That's the idea. And so you need money to pay for the unfunded liabilities. You just kind of print the money, and it's not going to really create any problems because we owe the money to ourselves. Well, first of all, we don't owe the money to ourselves. A lot of foreigners, including the Chinese, own government debt. And when you had inflation in the late 1970s, I remember there was a period of time where there was no bid on Treasury securities. These are AAA Treasury securities, and there was no bid. So in a laissez-faire market, you got to be very careful what you do. And I looked at a textbook by the advocates of modern monetary theory, and they had no chapter on growth theory, nothing on growth. It was all about redistribution of income. It was all about full employment, but there was nothing about economic growth. And I said, how can you write a whole book on economics and macroeconomics and not have a chapter on the Solow model and growth and economic growth? And they had that kind of stare like, oh my gosh, we really blew it, didn't we? No, they actually defended themselves. Oh, we don't need a growth theory. We don't think much of the Solow growth theory and all of this kind of stuff.
Okay, I'm just looking up what our current U.S. published national debt is. Holy moly. 31 trillion, 465 million, and so on.
Are you looking at the debt clock?
Yeah, the debt clock.
Have you ever looked at the debt clock website?
Oh my God, it's astonishing. I mean,
the lights are going up everywhere.
Yes, and like your family's share of the debt. Who do I owe that? Who do I owe that money to?
Well, obviously, the thing is, the government has constantly borrowing all this money, and you have to pay it back at some point. We've taken advantage of these low interest rates for a long period of time. So the biggest danger is, we're headed for some kind of a monetary crisis with the debt because of rising interest rates. If the rates keep going up higher, there will come a time when the interest on the debt will be the most expensive part of government, ahead of welfare payments, ahead of defense spending. And that's kind of scary when you reach that point. Canada actually faced that situation in the mid-90s when it was called the Canadian peso. The Canadian dollar was dropping in value. They had these huge interest payments. And they actually controlled it. The Liberal Party and the Conservative Party of Canada got together in the mid-1990s, they said, well, we got to cut government spending. We have to get our debt under control. They went on a big supply side tax cut period, and the Canadian dollar got strong and everything. They really solved their problem for 10. They cut the corporate tax rate to 12% and got a lot of foreign capital coming in because of it. It was a big win-win for a long period of time. They have their problems now, but there was it just goes to show you that we can, when push comes to shove, our leaders can step up, work together, and solve our problem. But it takes a crisis. And so consensus develops rather quickly when we face a crisis. And this is why I'm optimistic about America, because whether it's wartime or a financial crisis and so forth, we've always had the guts to come together and say, oh, we got to bite the bullet, we got to do X, Y, and Z, and we're willing to do it, willing to sacrifice and do it. So maybe that'll happen.
Let me ask you about social spending to help those in need to survive and flourish, such as the homeless, mentally ill, physically handicapped, unemployed, and children with such necessities as shelter and housing, childcare, food, energy, education, job training, and medical care. Those I'm just reading from an essay I wrote on classical liberalism. Those on the left feel we do not do enough to support citizens in need, while those on the right argue that too much social spending is enabling those who should be helping themselves. There are elements of truth in both of these extreme responses, but the fact is that today, the strongest and fastest growing economies in the world allocate anywhere from 20 to 30% of their GDP to social expenditures, including, in order, France, 31.5%, Finland, 30.8%, Belgium, 29%, Italy, 28%, Denmark, 28%, Australia, 27%, Austria, 27.8%, Sweden, 27.1%, Germany, 25.3%, the UK, 21.5%, the United States, 19.3%, and Australia, 19.1%, with uber liberal Canada bringing up the rear at 17%. We're 2% higher than Canada in social spending. When social spending made through employers instead of government, such as healthcare, retirement, and disability, is factored into the equation, the USA rises from 24th place to second in overall social expenditures. Nevertheless, we still boast the largest economy in the world. And, Germany's another model of this. It seems like, so this is the argument that liberals make, social spending is not only a moral good, don't we have a moral obligation to help those who can't help themselves, and private religious support of these people that have needs is not enough. We need government. This is the argument. And look, it doesn't hurt the economy. In fact, we have this robust growing economy despite 20% of our GDP being allocated to social spending. Your thoughts?
So there's a couple of things here. One is the work of Charles Murray is very important here, called Losing Ground. He did a study and found, and there's no, I think this is well established, that poverty was dropping in the United States steadily in a secular decline until the war on poverty started in 1965 with LBJ. And now, it's been steady because we constantly subsidize poverty and we don't really solve the problem. We just throw money at it. So I really admire the 1996 Welfare Reform Act that Bill Clinton signed in office and worked with the Republicans on it. It said that basically if you are a able-bodied American out of work, you got 5 years. After 5 years, you're off. You're going to be cut off, and you better get out there and find a job. And this was the only time period when that existed, and it was discontinued by President Obama because of the 2008 financial crisis. Okay, it's always a financial crisis. It was actually working really well. The number of people on food stamps, the number of people on Medicaid actually declined for the only time in its history. You can look on the charts. So there's something to be said for that. The other thing that's really important is the welfare principle, and we need to be very careful we don't violate the welfare principle. The welfare principle says you help those who need help, which you just mentioned, but very importantly, you don't help those who don't need help. Okay, so it's an important balancing act as to where that is. So means testing is extremely important. You don't want to have food stamps too generous. You don't want to have Medicaid too generous, where the fraud and people are playing all kinds of games and stuff like that. 41 million Americans are on food stamps right now. I think that's too much.
Wow.
We need to work at reducing that. People on Social Security and Medicare, I think that is also mismanaged because we're subsidizing Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. We're paying for their retirement. We're paying for their medical expenses because they all have a Medicare card. I asked Warren Buffett, I said, do you have a Social Security card? Yes. Do you have Medicare? Yes. Well, do you think do you think the taxpayer should be paying for your retirement and your Medicare? No. So I'm in the same boat. I consider myself wealthy enough that I can take care of my own retirement. I can take care of my own medical expenses. But no, I have a Medicare card, so it violates the welfare principle. So thank goodness that LBJ didn't create the food care program. Instead, it was the food stamp program, and you had a means test. And people tell me, well, it's a right to have medical services and stuff like that. Well, isn't it a right to have food too? Should we create the food care program? And so I do a wonderful exercise in front of investors at the Money Show. There'll be 1,000 people in the audience. And I'll say, okay, by show of hands, how many of you are on Medicare and Social Security? And almost every hand goes up because most of them are really wealthy people. And I said, now keep your hands up. How many are on food stamps? Woof, every hand goes down. And I said, why is that? And he said, well, that's a welfare program. I would never take food stamps. And I said, no, that's not the reason. The reason is you have a means test and you don't qualify. And if we did have one where there was no means test, you would have food stamps on you right now. So there's really something to be said for limiting. You need to limit our generosity, if you will, because otherwise you destroy people's initiative to produce on their own and get out there and get off their duff. And by the way, my wife and I did a lot of volunteer work in Yonkers, New York, with people that were on welfare, out of wedlock. They dealt with drug problems. They have all kinds of issues. And this was an important lesson for us because we learned, first of all, that every person had a job. Okay, they were on welfare; they all had a job, but it was for cash, right? They would babysit, they would do house cleaning, they would do construction, and be paid in cash. Nobody likes to sit around. Americans, even on welfare, don't want to sit around watching TV all day. They're active, maybe doing the drug deals as well. So this idea of the universal income idea of giving everybody $1,000, oh, we're going to solve the welfare problem by giving people $1,000 a month. Well, this is poppycock because you still need caseworkers to help people because they got more problems. Money is not going to solve their problem. They have mental problems. They have lots of problems with family and drugs and crime and all of this stuff is not going to be solved by throwing money at the problem.
Right. Well put. Sometimes I'll hear from conservatives, particularly religious conservatives, that we don't need any of this social program. Religion, this is what religions do. They provide housing, they man the soup kitchens, and this is where it should come privately. Are there any studies that show that that's just never going to be enough to support the people that are truly in need, set aside the fraud that goes on?
I think we're underestimating the ability of private volunteer organizations, including churches, to deal more effectively with the poverty programs and the drug programs and so forth. My wife and I volunteered at Sing Sing Penitentiary for 12 years. We taught, not as inmates, but as teachers. And it was just a great experience, both of us, to see how we could change their lives through education and make them come back into society as good citizens who aren't going to commit vicious crimes. Most of them are in for murder or worse in this state prison called Sing Sing that most people, go is quite famous in history. and it was all volunteer. It was all volunteer. And in fact, the Pell Grants were denied at this time. And so a nonprofit organization called Hudson Link was created. It was funded privately by individuals, including Warren Buffett's sister, Doris. And let me tell you something, it made a difference in their lives. It wasn't just a straight government program. It was more, yes, the state prison provided the facility for the education and so forth, but everything, the books, the teachers and everything, it was all privately funded, and it was very effective. And I just think we sell ourselves short into saying, oh, the government has to do all of this stuff. And I've already indicated the war on poverty, the war was lost the day the war on poverty started. So I think this is where the bully pulpit is beneficial. I think nudging of some sort would be beneficial with the tax deductibility of companies, private companies and churches focused on dealing with people. I personally think we could get rid of it, or at least reduce it to a substantial margin.
Do you apply that also to the war on drugs? Just decriminalize it, legalize it, tax it, regulate it?
Yeah, I'm more in Milton Friedman's camp, who says the government can't tell me what comes out of my mouth. Why can they tell me what goes into my mouth or into my body and so forth? I do use the example of AAA, Alcoholics Anonymous, AA. When did that get started? Do you know?
1930s,
what year?
Right? Was it 30?
Yeah, but it was after Prohibition ended.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so they legalized alcohol, and then they realized there were a lot of drunk people out there and they needed help, and so AA got started, and it was a Christian group who started it. And so there's a lot to be said for if we legalize drugs, and we're moving in that direction because of the abuse and so forth, and we saw it in prison. I mean, a lot of the murderers that were there were young people in a drug bust that ended up shooting somebody and were in for life or for 20 years in Sing Sing Penitentiary, and they all realized the mistake that they made. So if you legalize drugs, there is going to be abuse, and we've got to be alert to that. We need to focus more on education.
But there's abuse anyway.
Rather than banning, I noticed they're trying to ban cigarettes now everywhere and stuff. We're moving back to prohibition, and it's really unfortunate, I think. We need to persuade people. And if we're not persuading people and we're moving to the force, that means we're doing a lousy job of persuading people.
So these sin taxes that economists talk about, that's one way to do it, right? Just put taxes on cigarettes so high that it makes it just prohibitively expensive to take up as
right, but there's the unintended consequence of the black market that you create there. So you have to have a balance. You can have a tax. You've got to have it related to expense to deal with people on drugs and so on, but you don't want to do it as a way to prohibit, because that's basically prohibition, and it creates the unintended consequences of the illegal drug trade. And the reason the Mexican problem at the borders with the Mexican drug cartels is largely because that we impose too big of a penalty on drug use in the United States.
Let me ask you about prostitution. Should we just decriminalize it and treat it like any other business? That's kind of the liberal interpret. These are sex workers, not prostitution. Just consider it a form of labor, and it's regulated, unionized, taxed, and so on. Which I always thought was a good idea. And then I had this woman on my podcast, Rachel Moran, who wrote this book on her life in prostitution, and now she's an activist against prostitution. Just criminalize the whole thing, especially the Johns, because it's abusive to women. So there are models, like in Australia, I think it is, or maybe it's New Zealand, where it's treated as sex work, regulated and taxed and so on. But that, in fact, the women end up getting abused anyway. Like there's these places that are essentially hotels that rent rooms out by the hour. And the hotels make money mainly from the Johns, and the women have to rent the rooms and pay the hotel. And when the Johns complain that they didn't get what they wanted or whatever, the hotels cater to the Johns because that's where the money's coming from, and the women are still abused, not to mention the physical abuse, the drugs, and so on. she thinks government really needs to step in and just ban it. And I'm not sure what to think on it. I hadn't really thought about it that much till I talked to her and thought, oh yeah, okay, there is a lot of abuse there. That's not good. What do you think on that?
Yeah, I tend to be rather sympathetic with her point of view, and my Christian background suggests the same thing, that it is immoral behavior. But it's kind of like abortion and so forth. There's an element of practicality that has to enter in here. In the case of abortion, it's just the technology is there that makes it so easy to get an abortion. You really can't ban it. I think that's a mistake. But regulation does make a lot of sense to me. And the same thing with prostitution. I spent a lot of time in Las Vegas at Freedom Fest, and you see those stupid trucks going by with the big signs saying, we can have sex and you can have a woman in your room in 10 minutes. And if it's insulting to the senses, it demoralizes, it degrades Vegas because Steve Wynn and all these guys they did a lot to bring in a new image of Las Vegas that was family friendly and so forth. And then they allow these trucks to go by, and they've been able to promote and the kids on the street passing out the pictures of naked women and stuff like that. It's just, and they all have it because of freedom of expression, First Amendment. I think that was a misinterpretation. So, if you had private streets and stuff like that, then you could prohibit it legally and it wouldn't be a problem. But because they are public roads and stuff, I think you do need to have some kind of a regulation there. So I'm more of a utilitarian in that regard. The same reason I'm for eminent domain, because you're not going to have any freeways going from A to B directly unless you have eminent domain. So There are some things that make certain common sense to me in terms of government policy and so forth. So I'm not an anarchist, and I'm not totally into legalizing and not regulating these illicit activities.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask you about the Pareto distribution and power laws, monopolies, duopolies, and so on. In free markets, it seems like there is market capture by a handful of people, right? Power laws, 10% of authors make 90% of the money, 10% of athletes make 90% of the money, and so on, musicians and whatnot. How many diaper companies are there? What, 2, 3? There's not that many car companies, the alcohol companies, there's just a handful.
Plenty of car companies. Come on. You're wrong about cars.
Well, okay, but there's not 1,000 car companies, right? There's only so many that
there are dozens.
Yeah, okay, that's true, right? And that would be the case with beer, right? And alcohol, there's now lots because that was deregulated. What I'm getting at is how do you prevent monopolies from how many search engines are there, really? Come on, there's Google and a couple others. And there's just not or Twitter, right? How come there aren't a dozen Twitters? Because everybody's on Twitter. They captured the market before anybody else. And despite Trump's huge public profile and all the money in the world, Truth Social will never be Twitter. It just won't, because it's too late. Twitter captured the market. How do you prevent something like that in a free market system?
You have to take an historical perspective here, and there's a term that economists use called leapfrogging. And leapfrogging basically says that if you give yourself enough time, you're going to have a new company, a new competition coming along, but it's taking a while because the barriers to entry are rather high. You can't just start an oil company. You got to have rigging, and you can't just start an automobile company. It takes millions of dollars to get investing and stuff. So there are these barriers to entry that are natural. And in those cases, you have to give it a little more time. I mean, IBM dominated the computer industry for years. Now it does not. And you have lots of they used to make personal computers and so on. They don't anymore. That's done by Apple and HP and so forth. So it's called leapfrogging. You see this in banking. You see this in communications. You see it in all these industries that have only a small number of buyers and sellers. You used to have the big three in automobiles, and that doesn't exist anymore.
Good point.
And look at the deregulation of airlines, and airlines are merging, but they're also creating these new airlines that you see all the time. I mean, you realize Delta used to be just a southern company. Southwest used to be just in Texas, and the California company, Pacific or something, was bought out. But lots of these companies there's just a lot that was very unpredictable once you deregulated the economy. So I'm not a big fan of antitrust, breaking up companies, because I do think there's a natural tendency to break these companies up. And look at Google dominates, and I did call Hal Varian one time, and I said, Hal, so I tell you what, I'm thinking of going to DuckDuckGo because that's private, and they don't keep track of what I go to, and sometimes I think it's sensitive what I go to on Google. So I'm going to go to DuckDuckGo. What do you think of that, Val? You know what he said? He said, you just go right ahead. We don't care. But you're right. There's that attitude of winner take all. We have the winner take all market. But, Microsoft, Apple, Yahoo, a lot of these companies are trying to make inroads, and maybe at some point they will. But usually companies that dominate like that, it's because they have a better model and they're more advanced, they're ahead. Look at Tesla. Is Tesla going to maintain its market?
No, because everybody has great electric cars now. I mean, several of them I have been in they're nicer than Teslas. Like the Mercedes all-electric car. It's stunning. It's way better than my Tesla.
Hey, did you see my confrontation with Elon Musk, which has gone viral on Facebook and everywhere?
No.
Oh yeah, well, you got to see it. So I was at the Barron Investment Conference in November, and Elon Musk showed up because Barron mutual funds have a big position, one of the biggest in Tesla. So Elon Musk flew in on his private jet. He was kind of blurry-eyed and stuff like that. So he said, after being interviewed, they said, well, we'll take questions from the audience. And out of 5,000 people, I was selected probably because I was the only guy with the hat on. And so I said, so Elon, first of all, I quoted from Seneca, there's no great genius without a touch of madness. And to which he replied, I like the madness part. But then I asked him, I said, so why should I invest in Tesla, which is already down 40% from its high, and it's still selling at 70 times value and not paying any interest? Wouldn't it be better if I bought Mercedes-Benz that is selling for 6 times earnings and yielding 9%, and they produce EVs, and they're going to give you some competition? And this interview, so Elon Musk replies, I've never recommended, I think Tesla is overvalued. I warn people against it, but
Really?
We're still ahead of all the competition in terms of self-driving cars and batteries and SpaceX and stuff like that. And he said something interesting. He said, every one of the graduates from the Ivy League schools want to work for us. So they're going to have an advantage in that respect also. But I tend to agree with you. I think there's a leapfrogging effect. And so I don't really worry about it. Yeah. Adam Smith advocated, this is his 300th year of his birth. So I'm giving a whole bunch of lectures on Adam Smith and the genius of Adam Smith. So he basically said, under the rules of law, if you give people maximum freedom under a competitive system where you allow a lot of competition globally, you will maximize your standard of living. You'll have the best that will help both rich and poor will benefit from this. So he thought his model would actually reduce inequality, not increase it.
Interesting. All right, Mark, I got a hard out coming out here, so let me just ask you one last big question. Crypto. What are your thoughts on crypto?
You're not going to ask me about gross output?
Oh, I forgot about that. I think people will be more interested in crypto because that's the new thing, right? It's like
Well,
yeah.
let me, Mike, looking, gross output is also the new thing. And I just want to say something about it because it's important that your
Yeah, go
people
ahead.
know
Sure. Yeah.
that in the financial markets, there's a top line and a bottom line in national income accounting. You have sales at the top and profits at the bottom. And no good analyst on Wall Street, he's not going to be able to do well unless he looks at both the top and the bottom line. Same thing needs to apply in economics. So I came up with the idea of gross output, which is a measure of the top line of national income accounting. It's total spending in the economy. It includes the supply chain. And then the bottom line is GDP, which does not include the supply chain. It's just final output. Why is gross output important? Because it measures the supply chain. It emphasizes the importance of the supply side of the economy, which drives the economy. It's not consumer spending. That's the effect. It's business and the innovation and saving and investing. And so if people go to grossoutput.com, they can find out more about GEO. So I just wanted to get that in because that's
cool. All right.
That's my contribution to economics, and I think it's an important one. But in terms of crypto, I'm having constant arguments with my friends John Mackey of Whole Foods, of Alex Green of the Oxford Club. All of these people think it's just a bubble. There's no backing. How do you tell the value? Is it overvalued? Is it undervalued? These are all legitimate issues, and I'm not one to say they're right or they're wrong. I'm more of a independent spectator, if you will, looking at this. And I just don't think we should sell it short and just say, oh yeah, there's nothing to this. It's lasted a lot longer than Tulip Mania, which was only 3 years of a bubble. There's elements of the bubble here with that they come up with, like what was that dog's what was that one?
Doge. Yeah,
that was totally made up. So it kind of reminds me of the dot-com boom, where there was a lot of questionable, crazy things that had no backing whatsoever. But I think people are worried that in today's world, we need something as a hedge against irresponsible government behavior. You'll notice that Bitcoin really took off in 2021, reaching an all-time high, I believe, in this period of craziness with the government, the lockdown, and all that sort of thing. People were questioning all of that. And also the inflation that was coming. So I thought it was an inflation hedge. And then in 2022, when the Fed started raising rates and saying, hey, we're going to fight inflation, you notice Bitcoin dropped pretty dramatically, fell in half.
Yeah.
But now it's making a comeback because the Fed is backing off and the Biden administration is banning oil and gas right and left. At least that's what they want to do. There's a lot going on that suggests that people want a private alternative. There's supposed to be elements of privacy in Bitcoin and so forth. So I think the jury is still out on this. Okay. And certainly everybody's a big fan of the blockchain, which came out of the crypto, right? Crypto came up with the idea, the people behind it with the blockchain. And I'm really looking forward to the time when title insurance is totally eliminated because of blockchain, right? Shouldn't you be able to have total transparency in ownership of real estate properties so you don't need title insurance anymore?
Yeah,
Why should we pay thousands of dollars every time we buy and sell a home? You and I have had to do this. We pay all this money. They have really nice buildings, but what do they do? Do they really?
I don't know. I always wonder about that because you buy a house and then you get the bill from the title company and everybody takes a piece of the action. Yeah. All right, Mark.
I'm curious. You got to tell me what your opinion is of crypto, or you think
I'm not going to invest in it. I'm going for just the regular old stock market companies I've heard of, and I understand what they do. If I can understand it, I've watched the crypto explainers and the Bitcoin videos and all that stuff. Like, okay, I really still not getting this, so I'm not going to put my money in it. That's my opinion at this moment.
Well, they always say that nobody's more bearish than a sold out bull.
Oh, that's funny. That's a perfect place to end it.
That's from
all
my
right, everybody. We went an hour
Okay.
and 46 minutes. That was fabulous, and still only touched a bit of your long, beautiful cover story for Skeptic. Go to skeptic.com, click on the magazine, order it right there, and you can read all the details. Great graphs in there. A nice explainer of the economy. Mark, thank you so much. That was a great conversation. You really taught us a lot.
Michael, thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you.